Internment in Shanghai, an American family's fight for survival. Can you imagine what it was like to be a victim of a forced insurrection and then surviving against all odds? This is a true story, a scary reminder of those who suffered at the brutal hands of the Japanese military during World War II, including my family. The story started a long time ago. My mother, an American born to American parents in Vladivostok, Siberia in 1906. She was, if nothing else, a beautiful woman and a survivor. Her early childhood played out on the stage of historic times, the fall of the Russian Tsar, the Bolshevik Revolution, and 2 world wars. The change and turmoil through the opening decades of the 20th century included her unfortunate and life-changing experience and internment in a Japanese concentration camp. It could be said that this book is a love story. My mother fell in love at 12 years old. My father, a handsome American naval officer and doctor named Thomas Balfour Mackey Dunn, visited Vladivostok in 1918 on the ship the USS Brooklyn. And they were entertained by my grandparents, the only Americans in Vladivostok at the time, who owned the largest import-export business there. My mother danced and sang for the handsome officers, yet years went by. Then, during a chance meeting on a ship where they were both returning to Shanghai, they met and fell in love. Shortly thereafter, my parents were eloped, and then they settled down together for an absolutely wonderful, magical life in Shanghai. My mother entered Shanghai society at its very peak, the life of the rich and pampered, a privileged life beyond the dreams of most of humanity. Tom, her husband, was a wealthy and successful doctor in the richest city in Asia at that time. During his career, he treated not only members of the foreign community, but also notable Chinese, including Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and Chinese President, and Liu Xun, and the most prominent writer of the era, whom my father correctly diagnosed with having tuberculosis. Wealth afforded them a mansion along with 11 servants in Shanghai's upscale international settlement. Invitations were forthcoming to the most sought-after parties and events. Together, I think it's fair to say they had the world on a string. My mother had the good fortune of being a striking beauty, and from her stories we know she was highly regarded and glamorous socialite who thoroughly enjoyed all the aspects of her lifestyle in one of the world's grandest cities in the world at that time. This is a story about my mother's journey from the privileged and secure life in pre-World War II Shanghai to the ugly realities of a city under Japanese occupation, and lives condemned to internment camps. It is a vivid account of her efforts to hold her family together and preserve as much normalcy as possible while facing cruel hardships and incessant fear as the world descended into global war. The Japanese army attacked eastern China to begin with in August of 1937 and occupied all of Shanghai, but not the foreign settlements of the city where my parents resided. For foreigners, life continued remarkably unchanged until that fateful day, December 7th in the United States and December 8th in Shanghai, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Life for my parents and everyone else in that city would dramatically change. My twin sister and I were way too young to know what was going on, but we were forcibly removed from our house after, I want to show you this picture, after the Japanese soldiers riding into the international settlement where we lived, 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. My parents' home was in this beautiful section of Shanghai, which previously described to you. And can you imagine the horror of seeing armed soldiers watching into their home turf, a lovely, peaceful neighborhood? My mother and father were about to have their lives ripped apart by the Chinese invaders of Shanghai. Here is a picture of my maternal grandmother, my twin sister and me, that's me on the right, tagged. Those tags are for where we were to be transported like cattle to the Japanese concentration camp. Oh, gosh, this picture. Of course, I was too young to remember anything, but my grandmother and my mother and my parents suffered, leaving their wonderful life behind. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the insurrection began. The Japanese started interning many of Shanghai's foreign residents. The internments began in 1942, and I can tell you, my mother will never forget the day that my father was dragged out of the house by Japanese military, and my mother was left at home with her mother and the twins, me and my twin sister. The viciously cruel Japanese military police launched raids. On the day of internment, 243 Britons, 65 Americans, 20 Dutch, and some 24 others, totaling 350 in all, the so-called prominent citizens, including my father, were hauled off to Haiphong Road Camp, run by the Imperial Japanese Army. It is estimated that between 1941 and 1945, 14,000 foreigners in China and Hong Kong were imprisoned, with Shanghai having 12 internment camps. 4 months later, the rest of us left behind our privileged lives, and we were hauled into Chapai civilian internment camp in March of 1943. And here's a picture of us in front of our house before being whisked off to our life of internment. Most of the imprisoned were confined in camps until the war was terminated by the U.S. Bombing of Nagasaki in August of 1943. We were part of an American I have to back up. Most of the imprisoned were confined in camps until the war was terminated by the U.S. atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. But my family was lucky. We were an exchange of prisoners in 1943, so we were released from camp early and we sailed home to America, first on the Japanese ship, a wreck of a ship called the Taya Maru, to Goa on India's west coast, where we were transferred to the luxurious Swedish ship, the Gripsholm, arriving back in New York in 1943, December of that year. My mother's story of this experience was written shortly after her return to California. My sister and I were too young to remember, but we were grateful to have her detailed and very personal account of this extraordinary experience of her imprisonment, held against our will behind barbed wire with armed guards making sure we did not escape. The psychological impact of this brutality on anyone is huge. Camp conditions at Chapai internment camp were, relatively speaking, not dire, but what comes through loud and clear in my mother's story is her irrepressible spirit in the face of harsh realities. The realities of confinement. You're just like trapped. The psychological impact was enormous, as you can well imagine. Even though my mother was a glamorous socialite who wanted for nothing, a person with few responsibilities, I can tell you she suffered greatly in silence, especially over the fate of my father, and for fear of the safety of her family, prior to and during internment. Hers was a psychological and emotional torture of the worst kind. She battled hard to make things well for all of us by putting on a brave face, keeping up appearances as best she could, always holding her head high. Under no circumstances would she allow the Japanese to get to her, no matter how deplorable her experiences became. Through her entire life, she had the ability to overlook anything and everything negative around her, no matter how disastrous. Internment left my mother with a loathing for the Japanese, which lasted throughout her lifetime. Given her experience, the hatred is understandable. The trauma of the situation and the perspective from which she was writing must always remember. Her husband had been taken away and her home confiscated. She went into a living hell, and the entire time she was scared to death, not knowing the fate of my father. But at the same time, she had a profound love for the people of China, a love and devotion that lasted her entire life. So in the face of evil and extreme circumstances, my mother's irrepressible spirit and courage and superb survival instincts came shining through. She was a truly remarkable woman who lived an extraordinary life during an incredibly amazing, extraordinary period in history. In this day and age, it is difficult to comprehend having everything you own gone with the wind. But my mother endured her internment and forced separation from her beloved husband with grace and dignity. And all these experiences of hers are told with the attitude and grace of an absolutely remarkable woman.